Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is the last of the history lectures, History Lecture 28, on the question of art history in an art school. I'm just going to use this lecture to recapitulate and underscore some of the questions that I've been raising about the relation between art history and studio art, especially in an art school setting. And I'm going to raise a couple of new questions there at the end about instructors recommending artists. The basic problem that I've been emphasizing since the first of the history lectures is that there's a big difference between art history and art instruction. Art history, the field, the discipline, is made by people in universities, and it's made in general for people who work in universities and study in universities and colleges. This is a photograph of a session in the CIHA conference, the International Association of Art Historians. They have their own banner, and they've unveiled it here, and they're taking pictures of it. The School of the Art Institute is actually the largest art history department in the entire United States, including universities. And that means that we hire mainly the most desirable recent PhDs from major universities. And the result is that we have a university model of art history instruction. So we're a very good example of the distance between the two fields, especially because all of our faculty adapt and are committed to teaching in an art school, but they come from a very different point of origin. This is as opposed to many smaller colleges and departments, especially in other parts of the world, where most of the art history faculty would be artists and not products of PhD programs. Only a few of our faculty in art history here have MFAs or art practices. So because the discipline of art history is aimed mostly at scholars and university students in general, the discipline itself is organized according to periods and regions. This is just an example of a job listing. Visiting assistant professor in global medieval art history. Usually the ads are for specialists in Renaissance or Eastern Europe, Japan, different periods, in other words, in different parts of the world. So that's the way that art history is organized professionally, and it leads to art historians researching in these different periods and regions. But of course, that's not the way that artists think of art history or use art history. And you don't usually say to yourself, oh, what I really need for my work is an understanding of the period 1550 to 1600 in Italy or something like that. Usually artists work by themes and problems, and those themes and problems can cut across periods. So the very structure of art history, that it's structured by periods and cultures and so on, styles, is antithetical to the very structure of the way that artists use art history. So in order to make art history as a discipline into something of maximal use to artists, it would have to be completely dismantled and rethought along the lines of problems and themes. So there's a big contrast. There's a big contrast between the way that art history is organized and the way that artists use art history. I'll give a couple of examples of that. In general, as a generalization, artists plunder or appropriate from any time and period that they think could be useful to them. And that means that that will completely change the context, sometimes, of the work that's appropriated. That's Basquiat, a collage called Muhammad Ali. A couple of other examples of this. These are just more or less random, typical examples. I think maybe the most famous one in art history, the most famous example of an artist appropriating or using art history within art historical texts is Van Gogh and Gauguin looking at Japanese prints. And so that's a famous moment in fin de siècle, turn of the century Western art history. And it also had its repercussions in Japan, and Japanese artists were influenced by the Western appropriation of Japan, so there was a back and forth there. But there were, of course, particular misunderstandings on both sides, as there are in any kind of cultural exchange. So even though this is sometimes taken to be a kind of an approach between, in this case, Japan and French art of the 1880s and 90s. Also, it's just an example, a more typical example of a kind of remaking, reinvention, not a scholarly appropriation. I've mentioned Damien Hirst with his cliched versions of the Baroque in a sculpture series that he called Wreck of the Unbelievable, that don't have very much to do with the Baroque. They have to do with early 21st century idea of the Baroque. Brian O'Doherty, a.k.a. Patrick Ireland, the artist, did a series of works which refer to a medieval script called Ogham script in Ireland. And this actually doesn't look much like Ogham script, but the idea of what he was doing was he wanted to bypass the whole modern history of art in his country, in Ireland, in favor of a pre-Christian, druidic kind of a past. So this was a way of reimagining history, of thinking about history, which deliberately goes around or ignores or jumps over all of the frames of reference that an artist in his place, from his position, would be expected to engage in. So it's a very non-art historical thing to do in one sense, because it's as if you had ripped out all the main pages of your survey text, except for the first couple pages on prehistoric art, and you had decided that that was your history. O'Doherty wasn't the only artist to do that in his generation. Joseph Beuys is another example. He made all kinds of different references to Upper Paleolithic paintings in his own drawing practice. Some of them borrow directly from photography, and others mix photography and other modern references with attempts to bring cave painting into the 20th century. He's got his signature down there with his hat above his signature. Kara Walker is another example. She used a wide variety of sources, including 18th and 19th century traditions of silhouette portraits. That used to be a thing that was much more common than it is now, that you would have your portrait done as a silhouette. And that's one of the things she plays off in her representations of race. Here she's also using a page from a book called Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War. So these are variably in accord with art historical understandings, and Kara Walker's would be very close to some art historical understandings of the antebellum South, but some of them are very far from art history, because that's the nature of art historical appropriation. Artist borrowings are always selective, and they're often idiosyncratic in the sense that only one artist would think of that kind of history and no one else would have that idea of history, as in the intuitive maps that I was talking about at the beginning of this series. Your map might not be like anybody else's. If someone was to collect all the art historical references that are made by major 21st century artists and put them on a timeline, the result would be just basically random collection of times and objects, styles, spaces. So there wouldn't be any predictable reasons, and there would be very few patterns. There would be some recurring motifs, like that interest in prehistory that I was talking about with Brian O'Doherty and also Joseph Beuys, but most of it would be scattered through history. And that's one reason why there is no history of art, quote unquote, from an artist's point of view. That's also why there's no textbook or class on artists' ideas of how to use art history. There are lots of examples, but maybe not enough patterns or connections. So there's a disconnect between the way that art historians present art history and the ways that artists use it. The last section here, I just wanted to raise an important point in day-to-day studio instruction, having to do with this habit that instructors have of saying that you should look at such and such an artist. It's really common to hear things like, you should look at Gerhard Richter, or your work reminds me of Howardina Pindell. Those kinds of recommendations are made by studio instructors, but often by art historians when they're in studios. And they're the main way that art history gets talked about in studio critiques, as opposed to in art history classrooms. In studios, art history comes in these kind of these sprinkles of references here and there made for different reasons. The problem with that kind of recommendation is that the instructor who says that almost never says at the same time why they think that particular artist should be of interest to you. So sometimes the instructor might see a resemblance, like maybe you make abstract painting and your instructor says, this reminds me of Gerhard Richter, or you should go look at Gerhard Richter. Maybe there's a systematic connection there, and maybe your work really is dependent on Richter and you don't know it. But it could also just be that the instructor was interested in the way that you smear red, or that you use a certain pigment that Richter also uses, and there's no other connection. So these recommendations can happen for all sorts of reasons. They can happen for systemic reasons. They can happen for really quirky reasons, and trivial reasons, marginal reasons. I like to recommend that when an instructor says you should look at work of a certain artist, you should always try to ask why they've asked that, and make sure that their answer makes sense. Like not just, oh, Richter uses red, something like that, but something that shows that they've thought about that kind of connection. I think a lot of instructors just tell students to look at other artists because it's easy. It's an easy thing to say. And the instructors themselves haven't really figured out if there is a strong connection or even if it would help. This is exactly what happens with the Survey of World Art. The instructors and administrators who set up the World Art History Survey and make sure that it's required in most institutions, they just hope and assume that art history is going to help artists to know, to make art, that it will help artists. It's on a large scale the same kind of thing as the assumption of an instructor who just says you should look at Howardina Pindell. That's one of her pieces there. But art historical knowledge isn't neutral when it comes to art practice. And so as an art historian, like, it won't hurt me if I read about some new culture or artist that I hadn't known about before. But as an artist, it can slow or alter your practice in ways that may not help you. Art history isn't really like vitamins. It's not like that it's always good to take them. It's more like pills in some unmarked container. Like if you take one, it's possible your work might suffer. You might end up thinking too much about that other artist. It's not always good to be influenced, and it's not always good to have your head filled with art historical references. So I would say that when art history comes up in the context of the studio, just always question it if you can, and see what the kind of connections are, and if your instructor has thought about what might happen if you do look at that artist. Often the answer will be perfectly benign. Like it would be like something like your work would be helped if you were to talk to this community of artists that includes Howardina Pindell, that kind of thing. But other times it can be a stray reference that can really derail your practice if you go into it too much. So to conclude this lecture and all of the history lectures, I just want to recall this notebook. This is a slide from lecture 14 about it's about the notebook done by a student who was interested in this painting by Tintoretto because she liked the way that the pearls were falling through the air, and she thought that the shape of the woman's knee was like a pearl. This is a kind of ideal use of art history because that student was absolutely unconcerned about being a bad student in the Renaissance art class. She only wanted to make sure that she collected the images that she wanted. So the moral is, if you're an art student, take what you want from anything that you find, images, ideas, cultures, periods, styles. You should feel completely free to ignore 99% of everything in art history, and even to reject the idea of having to learn art history at all. For an academic, learning art history is learning culture, adding information and ideas. For a college student, that's the general idea. But for an artist, learning art history is also learning to dismantle and reject art history. That's part of the learning of it because the use value of it is choosing and judging. What really matters in the end is to be confident about your choice of artists, the ones you choose to think about, and which communities you choose to be part of, real or imagined, because those are the ones that will help your practice. And anything else might distract you or even hurt your practice. So I guess I'm saying be very skeptical of art history. It hasn't always been around, and it's not necessarily the best friend to an art practice.